What would you do if the family you married into handed you a property they themselves were too superstitious to set foot on, laughing as they did it? For a young widow in the Adirondacks, that property was a lake house the family had spent 30 years calling cursed, a place with a locked boathouse no one had opened since a tragedy no one liked to discuss. They gave it to her certain the old stories would drive her off within a season. They never imagined that the curse itself had been invented, deliberately, by the one woman in the family with the most to hide. Settle in, and let us travel back to the autumn of 1975, to the still, dark waters of Lake Serrano in upstate New York, and the remarkable story of Josephine Whitfield and the boathouse at the end of Findlay Point. Josephine Whitfield stepped out of a borrowed pickup truck at the top of a long gravel drive, an aging black Labrador named Birch leaping down after her, and stood for a moment looking at the lake house through a screen of birch and pine. She was 28 years old, 4 months a widow, and she had learned in that short span of time exactly how little regard the Whitfield family held for her. She carried one duffel bag, Birch's leash wrapped twice around her wrist, and a small tin of her husband's fishing lures tucked carefully in her coat pocket. The only thing of his she hadn't been able to leave behind in the city apartment she could no longer afford. Her husband, Thomas Whitfield, had died in a small plane crash that summer, flying a client's chartered flight for the family's timber business, and Josephine had spent the months since discovering just how quickly a family's warmth could curdle once the son who'd married her was no longer there to insist on it. The reading of the will had taken place 6 weeks earlier in the Whitfield family's own study, dark-paneled and smelling faintly of pipe smoke, a room Josephine had always found unwelcoming even at the best of times. Preston Whitfield, Thomas's older brother, had presided over the reading with the easy authority of a man accustomed to getting his way. His wife seated beside him with an expression of poorly disguised satisfaction. "There's also the lake house," Preston had said. Once the timber company shares and the family's Manhattan holdings had been settled in his favor, exactly as everyone had expected. Findlay Point, out on Serrano. Nobody's used it in years. You know the old stories. He'd allowed himself a small, humorless smile. "Seeing as you'll need somewhere to land, we thought it only fair you have it." The family attorney had not smiled, had in fact looked faintly uncomfortable as he slid the paperwork across the desk. But he'd said nothing beyond the necessary legal language. Josephine had signed without comment, refusing to give Preston's wife the satisfaction of asking what old stories he meant. She would learn soon enough. The Whitfields did not give away a lake house worth what that property should have been worth out of generosity. They gave it away because none of them wanted to go near it, and dressing that fear up as a gift cost them nothing at all. Now, standing at the top of the gravel drive with Birch straining gently at his leash and the lake spread out silver and still beyond the trees, Josephine understood she had inherited more than a house. She had inherited whatever it was the family had spent 30 years too afraid to discuss. The house itself, when she followed the drive down toward the water, was not so much ruined as abandoned to a slow, deliberate decay. Shutters hung crooked on rusted hinges. The porch steps had rotted through in 2 places, forcing her to pick her way carefully to the door. Inside, dust sheets covered what furniture remained, and the air held the particular staleness of a house that had been closed up in anger rather than simple neglect. But it was the boathouse, visible through a gap in the trees down by the water's edge, that drew her eye and held it. A low wooden structure built out over the lake itself, its windows painted over from the inside, a heavy chain and padlock securing double doors that faced the water. Even from a distance, it looked wrong somehow, deliberately sealed in a way the rest of the property's simple neglect did not explain. For a long moment, standing in the cooling autumn air, Despair pressed down on her. They had not given her a lake house. They had given her whatever this family had spent 3 decades trying to forget. Let them think this place will break me, she thought, resting a hand on Birch's broad head. I have nowhere else to be, and I will not give any of them the satisfaction of leaving. The one person on Lake Serrano who greeted Josephine with anything resembling warmth was Del Alder, an old fishing guide and caretaker who'd looked after half the camps on the lake for longer than most of the current owners had been alive. He found her that first afternoon, standing uncertainly at the end of the dock, and offered, without being asked, to help her get the water and electricity running again before the weather turned. He asked no questions about the family's arrangements or the old stories everyone else seemed so eager to whisper about, and left her, by evening, with running water, a working wood stove, and the first real kindness she'd been shown since Thomas's funeral. That first night, Josephine made up a bed in the smallest of the upstairs rooms, farthest from the lake-facing windows, and lay awake long after the fire had burned low. Birch curled heavily against her side. Somewhere down near the water, faint but unmistakable, she heard a slow, rhythmic knocking, wood against wood, carried up from the direction of the boathouse on the still night air. She told herself it was loose boards shifting with the temperature, or a rope slapping against the dock in the wind. She did not yet know that the sound was rising from directly behind those painted-over windows, from a space no one had entered in over a decade. What does a person do when the family that should have supported her instead hands her the one place they're too afraid to go themselves? How do you find the courage to stay somewhere everyone else insists is cursed? Is it foolish to remain, or is remaining the only way to prove you were never as fragile as they assumed? Let us know in the comments what you would have done in Josephine's place. And if this is your first time with us, consider subscribing for more stories of quiet resilience. Because, in the weeks that followed, Josephine Whitfield was about to discover that the curse everyone whispered about had never been real at all, and that the truth sealed inside that boathouse belonged to a woman the family had spent 30 years trying not to remember. Her first trip into the small lakeside town of Millbrook for supplies came several days later, and it proved an education in exactly how far the old stories had traveled. The woman at the general store studied her with a mixture of curiosity and something close to wariness as she rang up her purchases. A pair of old-timers on the porch outside fell silent as she passed. One of them making a small, superstitious gesture she pretended not to notice. She understood without being told, the widow who'd taken on the cursed Whitfield place at Findlay Point, and the whole town seemed to know it. She was loading her small parcel into Del Alder's borrowed truck when Preston Whitfield's car pulled up outside the store. And Preston himself stepped out, dressed for a weekend at the family's other, far grander camp on the northern shore, his expression brightening with unpleasant amusement at the sight of her. "Josephine," he called out, loud enough to draw the attention of the porch. "Still out at Findlay Point, are you? Brave girl. Or perhaps you haven't heard the stories yet." He said it with the satisfaction of a man delivering a punchline he'd been saving. A ripple of uneasy laughter passed among the onlookers on the porch. Josephine felt the familiar heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her voice level and her gaze steady. "I've heard plenty of stories," she said simply. "None of them have kept the roof from holding." Preston's grin faltered, just slightly, at the calm precision of her reply. He recovered with a short laugh and climbed back into his car, driving off toward the northern shore without another word. Josephine finished loading her parcel and drove back toward Findlay Point with her chin level, refusing to let the town's lingering stares chase her into a hurried departure. She stopped the truck partway along the lake road to let Birch stretch his legs, and it was there, at a small roadside chapel that served the lake community, that she encountered a woman everyone in Millbrook simply called Old Nan, who tended the chapel's small garden and was rumored to remember every family on the lake back 3 generations. "You're staying out at Findlay Point," Old Nan said, not quite a question, straightening slowly from her weeding with a wince. Josephine only nodded. The old woman studied her for a long moment, with sharp, pale eyes. "That curse talk started with Eleanor Whitfield herself," Old Nan said finally, glancing toward the lake. "Not before. She's the one who first told folks something evil happened down at that boathouse, right around the time she stopped letting anybody near it. Always thought that was a strange thing for a grieving woman to spend her energy on, spreading fear instead of grief." She fixed Josephine with a long, searching look. "A story like that doesn't protect a memory, child. It protects a secret." She turned back to her weeding before Josephine could ask anything further, leaving the words to settle over her like the mist that crept across Lake Serrano each morning. Josephine carried them back to Findlay Point, turning them over with every mile, a small, stubborn splinter of curiosity, lodged too deep now to ignore. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm of steady, necessary labor. Josephine patched the porch steps with lumber Dell helped her haul from town. She scrubbed decades of grime from the windows until autumn light finally reached properly into the rooms. She cleared the overgrown path down to the dock, and slowly, the town's wariness began to thaw by small degrees. The general store owner started including an extra can of coffee in her weekly order without being asked. A pair of local boys, sons of one of Dell's fishing clients, began stopping by after school to help stack firewood, clearly more curious about the cursed house than frightened of it now that its new owner seemed so ordinary. It was during a careful inspection of the boathouse's exterior, checking for storm damage before the weather turned, that Josephine found the first true anomaly. The chain securing the double doors was, unlike every other piece of rusted hardware on the property, entirely free of corrosion, its links moving smoothly when she tested them out of simple curiosity. The padlock itself gleamed faintly, where everything else on the property had gone dull with neglect. And faintly, beneath the mineral smell of the lake, she caught a whiff of something sweeter, drifting from the gap beneath the doors, linseed oil and turpentine, entirely out of place in a structure meant only to house boats. It made no sense. By every account she'd gathered from Dell and the townsfolk, the boathouse had been sealed since sometime in the mid-1950s, not long after Eleanor Whitfield's own husband had died. And yet here was hardware that had clearly been tended, and a scent that suggested activity far more recent than 2 decades of abandonment should allow. She set the mystery aside through the following weeks, consumed by the practical demands of preparing the lake house for the coming winter. But every time she walked the path down to the dock, her eyes were drawn to that impossibly maintained chain. It was one deliberate, careful detail in a story otherwise written by decades of enforced silence. And slowly, she began to understand that the boathouse itself was speaking to her, in the only language a sealed building has, small, insistent details that refused to fit the story everyone else had settled on believing. The first true test of her resolve arrived in late October, when the radio in Dell's truck crackled with warnings of a powerful storm system building over the lake, and it was the need to properly secure the boathouse against the coming weather that finally sent Josephine looking, in earnest, for a way inside. Among the few of Thomas's belongings she'd kept was a small leather tackle box containing his fishing gear, and tucked into a hidden compartment beneath the lures, she found a single brass key she had never had occasion to use. One Thomas had once mentioned, offhandedly, as belonging to his mother's old boathouse, though he'd never explained why he carried it at all. Her hands trembled slightly as she fitted it to the padlock. It turned with a soft, well-maintained click. Beyond the doors lay not the boat slips she'd expected, but a long, narrow studio space built along the water's edge, easels and canvases stacked in careful rows against every wall, paint-stained rags and brushes arranged with obvious care on a worktable near the window. Dozens of finished paintings leaned against the walls, landscapes of the lake in every season and light, portraits of local fishermen and townsfolk rendered with a startling, luminous skill. And on a small desk near the door, sitting exactly where a hand might have left it mid-thought, was a thick, cloth-bound journal. Josephine carried it back to the house and read by lamplight long into the night, Birch dozing heavily by the wood stove. The handwriting inside was elegant and deliberate, filling page after page in fading ink. The first entry was dated the autumn of 1951. My husband believes a woman's talent is a pleasant hobby, suitable for watercolor sketches in a guest room and nothing more. The entry began. He does not know that I have been selling my work for 3 years now under another name entirely, and that collectors in the city speak of E. Vane with more respect than they have ever spoken of me at any dinner party in this house. The journal, Josephine realized as she read deeper into the night, belonged entirely to Eleanor Whitfield, and it documented a secret life pursued with remarkable discipline over nearly 2 decades, a painting career built under the pseudonym E. Vane, her work exhibited in small but respected galleries far from the lake, entirely unknown to the family that considered her nothing more than a wife and mother. My husband would forbid it outright if he knew, one entry read, dated several years later. And my sons would see only the money such work might bring, never the years of quiet discipline it took to earn a collector's respect. I will not let either impulse touch what I have built here. This studio is the only place I have ever been entirely myself. The final entries, written after her husband's death, described Eleanor's decision to seal the studio entirely, inventing the story of a tragedy at the Boathouse to keep her sons and their curious wives from ever wandering close enough to discover what she continued, in secret and increasingly failing health, to protect. I do not know who will find this after I am gone. The last entry read, the handwriting noticeably weaker than the pages before it. I only hope it is someone who understands that a woman's whole self does not always fit inside the roles a family assigns her. Let them be the one who finally lets E. Vane be known for who she truly was. Josephine closed the journal slowly, tears slipping free at last after weeks of carefully held composure. Before she could fully absorb what she'd read, the wind outside rose from a low moan to a full, driving roar, and within the hour, the storm that had been building over the lake broke with tremendous force, rain lashing sideways against the boathouse windows, waves driving hard against the old dock pilings. Josephine worked through the worst of the night by lantern light, hauling sandbags Dell had left behind against the boathouse's lake-facing wall, terrified that rising water might reach the canvases her mother-in-law had spent 2 decades protecting from a family who never knew to look for them. She worked until her arms shook, refusing, with a fierce, protective determination she hadn't known she possessed, to let the storm undo what Eleanor Whitfield had guarded so carefully in life. In the deepest hour of the storm, a frantic shout carried across the water, barely audible over the wind. Josephine took her lantern down to the dock and found a small boat, its motor dead, drifting dangerously close to the rocks along the point, a family of 3 aboard, the father struggling against oars that could barely make headway in the churning water. With Dell's dock rope and Birch barking encouragement from the shore, she helped haul the boat in close enough for the family to scramble onto solid ground, soaked through and shaking but unharmed. Without hesitation, Josephine brought them up to the house, built the fire high, and shared what food and dry blankets she had. The family's young daughter finally calming against her mother's shoulder, in the firelit warmth of a house the whole town still called cursed. For those hours, Findlay Point became exactly what Josephine now understood Eleanor Whitfield had always secretly hoped it might be again someday: a shelter, warm and generous, rather than a place defined by fear. The storm broke by early morning, and the family made their way home once the lake had calmed enough to risk the crossing, the mother pressing Josephine's hands in wordless thanks. Josephine stood alone afterward on the storm-battered dock, exhausted, and felt something settle inside her that had been unsteady since Thomas's death. She had protected the boathouse, and the strangers she'd pulled from the storm, not for what either might be worth, but because both had needed protecting. And she understood now that this had always been closer to the truth Eleanor had hoped someone would eventually understand. Word of the discovery spread through Millbrook slowly at first, then all at once. Once Dell mentioned the paintings to a friend who dealt in local art, and from there it reached a specialist named Corinne Marsh, who traveled up from a major auction house in the city specifically to see the studio for herself. She arrived on a crisp November morning and stood in stunned silence for a long moment before she trusted herself to speak. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said finally, "the art world has spent nearly 2 decades wondering what became of Eve Vane. Her work simply stopped appearing at exhibitions sometime in the mid-1950s, and no one ever learned why, or who she truly was. This studio, properly authenticated, will settle one of the more persistent mysteries in post-war American painting. And I can tell you now, even before formal appraisal, that a collection this size, from an artist this significant, is worth considerably more than every other holding your husband's family has ever claimed." Preston Whitfield arrived at Findlay Point a week later, having heard the news secondhand through half the lake community, before anyone thought to inform him directly. He stood in the doorway of the studio, looking at the canvases arranged now with proper care along the walls, at Corinne Marsh's paperwork spread across his mother's old worktable, at the quiet, unshakable dignity with which Josephine now moved through a place he had once considered a punishment too pitiful to bother visiting himself. He said nothing for a long moment. Whatever he had come to say seemed to wither behind his teeth. He looked at his own mother's hidden life, laid bare after 2 decades of enforced silence, at the widow he had mocked outside the general store, now spoken of throughout the lake community with something bordering on awe. And without another word, he turned and walked back to his car, and did not return. A year passed, and Findlay Point, once whispered about as the cursed property at the end of the lake, became instead something the community spoke of with quiet, growing pride. With the careful, considered sale of several paintings to museum collections, eager to finally complete their understanding of Eve Vane's work, Josephine restored the lake house properly, repaired the Boathouse studio's roof and windows, and opened it several afternoons a week as a small gallery honoring Eleanor Whitfield's long-hidden second life, the walls lined with the remaining canvases exactly as her mother-in-law had once arranged them. On a cold, clear afternoon the following autumn, Del Alder made his way down to the dock, as he did most days now. Finding Josephine in the studio, carefully cataloging a newly authenticated canvas, while Birch dozed in a patch of pale sunlight by the window. "They gave you the one place on this whole lake nobody wanted," Del said, settling onto a stool with a small, knowing smile, "and you turned it into the only place worth visiting." Josephine looked around the transformed studio, at the paintings watching from the walls with their luminous, patient light, at the desk where Eleanor had once sat writing entries she never expected anyone to find. "They didn't give me a cursed lake house," she said quietly, turning the words over the way she had turned old Nan's words over on that chapel path so many months before. They gave me back the woman they never once let her be. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this journey. This has been a story about the quiet strength of patience, and the idea that the stories a family tells to keep others away are sometimes the very stories hiding what matters most. If you found a piece of your own resolve in Josephine's story, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more tales of hidden treasures and unexpected triumphs. And let us know in the comments what forgotten boathouse, attic, or locked room you'd love to uncover a secret behind. We'll be back soon with the story of a lighthouse keeper's daughter, a locked lamp room, and a secret that had been waiting, quite literally, in plain sight.